Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and it's Tuesday. I don't always know what day it is, but I know today is Tuesday. I double-checked to make sure that I would get this podcast out on the right day. Yeah, how are you doing? How are you doing in isolation? Anybody else feel like it's slowly sucking their brain cells out? I feel really stupid some days. Like, the simplest tasks take monumental effort to figure out. Things that I've done a million times, suddenly I've forgotten how to do. I know I'm not the only one, but share your stories with me. Let's commiserate. I would love to hear I'd love to hear how you're doing anyway, but tell me how it's affecting you. Hopefully you are taking care of yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all of those ways, so that you are staying healthy in all possible ways during this time. And one thing we can do during this time is read and listen to podcasts. So, hey, here is a podcast about books. Seems perfect, right? Today, I do have an interview for you. Today, I'm speaking with author Alan Orloff about his new thriller called I Know Where You Sleep. Even the name sounds chilling, right? I mean, nobody wants to hear I know where. I just picture it, hear it in my head in a really creepy voice. You know, I know where you sleep. Yeah. I don't want to hear that. Let me go ahead and give you the description of the book. When Anderson West takes on the pro bono case of Jessica Smith, a 20-something restaurant hostess being stalked, the last thing he expects is for his investigation to spiral into breaking and entering, assault, and legal threats from the suspects and the victim. But that's what happens when you run a private investigation firm with your rule-breaking, loose cannon sister at your side. While Anderson spends his time deducing and interviewing possible suspects, Carrie handles interrogations in her own unique and personal fashion. And it seems like everyone is a suspect. There are Jessica's ex-boyfriend and current boyfriend, her incredibly creepy boss, and the suspicious reverend at her church who definitely seems to be hiding something or someone. The closer Anderson and Carrie get to an answer, the more danger Jessica finds herself in. Her stalker's notes become increasingly more threatening, trading the scary phone calls and text messages for terrifying photographs and notes at her gym, work, and home. To make things even more complicated, Jessica's backstory begins to unravel, and the secrets of her past could potentially solve everything, if only she'd let Anderson and Carrie in. With time ticking down, will the brother and sister investigative team be able to solve Jessica's case before she tries something foolhardy, like facing up to the tenacious bastard on her own, armed only with a handgun and a prayer? I apologize. I don't usually use language on the podcast. That's not too bad of a one, but took me by surprise. That is the description of I Know Where You Sleep by Alan Orloff. It is a thriller. We talked a little bit in the interview about the fact that it is more suspense than, you know, how I don't like the gory or the really, really, really like violently scary. Alan says he doesn't. This is not one of those books with an HBC, a high body count. I got a new acronym from this interview. So, yay, learning new things. Forgetting things too, but learning new things here in isolation. So I always appreciate that. This is definitely a page turner. If you like this sort of story with just suspense and the unknown, mystery, obviously, because Anderson and Carrie are trying to figure it out, what's going on, who is it, figure it out before it escalates even further than it does. And this book also has really great dynamics between Anderson and Carrie, between Anderson's children and his mother. His mother lives with him and his two children. So there's some great family dynamics in there as well, in addition to the story. In fact, it would be great, I think, if this had a series, because I think there are some characters in here that I would really enjoy watching how they develop and where they go and how their relationships evolve throughout the course of a potential series. So let's go ahead now and turn to the interview with Alan. Again, the book is called I Know Where You Sleep. Hi, Alan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am very happy to have you here to talk about your book, I Know Where You Sleep. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I've been writing fiction for maybe 15 years, and I write both novels and short stories. I Know Where You Sleep is my 9th published novel, and I just keep working away, keep writing and publishing, and trying to keep my head above water.
Sounds good. So, give a bit of an overview of I Know Where You Sleep, which, I mean, even the title, you can tell it's going to sound, it sounds ominous. So
it's going to be creepy,
the overview
right? And
yeah.
And if you see the cover, you'll know it's going to be creepy.
Exactly.
I wrote that, what inspired me to write it really was, I've always been a big reader. And I started reading in high school. I didn't read the classics, all the stuff that was assigned in our English class. I didn't understand it. It had no interest to me. So I would read a lot of science fiction, and then I moved on to horror, and I read a lot of that into my 20s. And I was working in Boston, and I had a boss who said, Alan, do you like to read? And I said, sure. Well, have you read a series about a detective, a private eye in Boston? And it was the guy's name is Spencer. And I said, I'll give it a try. So I read the first Spencer book, and then I loved it so much I just devoured it. So I've always had sort of that love for the Spencer type of private eye book. And I finally, in my ninth book, I finally had the opportunity to write a private eye novel. So I was very excited about that. The book itself really is about a brother and sister team, and the brother is the sort of the lead private eye, and he owns a private eye firm, and he's sort of taken in his sister because no one else will give his sister a job, and she works in the office. She's not a full-fledged private eye, but she kind of thinks she is, and she's got a bleeding heart, and she's got her own set of issues, you might say, some anger management issues, to be specific. So in this particular novel, a poor young woman is being stalked, and she comes into their firm wanting help in solving a problem. So that's sort of what kicks off the action, and throughout, Anderson, the guy, and Carrie, his sister, have to sort of attempt to find out who the stalker is and find out a way to stop him or her.
Yeah, and of course, it's never as simple as it seems. There's always hidden secrets in books like this, and of course, I won't go into them because we want people to read the book.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit more about Anderson and Carrie. They're very, very different. They're siblings, but they're very different. What about each of them do you think might resonate with readers?
Okay, sure. Anderson is more of your prototypical private eye. He's a tough guy. He's not. I wouldn't say he's exactly a rule follower, but he tries to keep his antics in check. He's concerned on the firm's behalf of not losing their license, of playing, not breaking any laws, at least none that they can be caught for. And sort of, he believes that hard work and diligence will get the job done. If he follows his private eye instruction manual, he will find the culprit. Now, Carrie, on the other hand, as you alluded to, is exactly the opposite. She never met a rule that she didn't want to break. So if you consider Anderson to be more of the ego, perhaps, Carrie is pure id all the way. And, as a writer, writing her parts was so much more fun than writing it from Anderson's point of view. So I had a lot of fun with just sort of letting it all hang out and, what's the kind of the craziest, worst thing someone might do in her position and getting a chance to write it that way. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, you spend a lot of the book going, oh man, what is she going to do now? And it's really a good, yeah.
I think Carrie, in a lot of ways, is one of those characters that makes you feel a little better about yourself because she makes such odd, seemingly crazy decisions, and you're like, well, at least I'm not doing that. She's very interesting, and I don't know if she's exactly likable, but she keeps you engaged for sure. So we're going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll be talking more about the voice of the book. It's written in both first and third person, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Alan was speaking about Anderson and Carrie, the siblings involved in the private investigative work in this book, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why he chose to write them in different voices.
In terms of their voice, you write Anderson in the first person and Carrie in the third. So what prompted that decision to write in the different voices?
Yeah, well, I think that writing in first person kind of brings the reader much closer to the character. Get that sense of intimacy, which I was really going for. And sort of the first person point of view style is maybe, I don't know if it's typical of a private eye novel, but it's very common in a private eye novel. But I'd also wanted to show things from Carrie's perspective. And I figured, a lot of books do it, have more than one first-person narrator. But when I read books like that, I get really confused. So I wanted to have a little distance between the reader and Carrie. Maybe I didn't want the readers to get too into Carrie's head for what might happen to them. But I thought it'd be interesting to sort of, have the main narrative in first person from Anderson's point of view, and sort of a secondary Carrie in third person. I hope I pulled it off okay. I think I did.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. Often when there's more than one character speaking in the first person, if it's not done well, it can be hard to figure out as you start each chapter who's speaking.
Exactly.
So their relationship is complicated. They're siblings. They work together. They are vastly different personalities. How does that relationship help to fuel the story or progress the story?
They were raised from the same family, and I do show some of them. Another thing I enjoyed writing was sort of the family dynamics. Anderson is widowed, and he's got two young children, and his mother. And I had a few scenes where those four are in the scene, along with Carrie, and sort of the different ways that they sort of approach just family dynamics. I thought that was interesting too. But both Carrie and Anderson have the same goal. They very much want to help this poor woman who's being stalked and solve the case. So part of the fun, I hope, for the reader is to see how two people with the same goal use very different means to achieve it. So again, Anderson was more of the doing things in the routine and sort of the typical way one might solve a case, where Carrie is more of the out-of-the-box thinker. She's willing to take a lot more risks than Anderson was. So I hope the counterpoint between the two proved to be interesting, as well as Anderson. Not only does Anderson have to worry about solving the case, he has to worry about keeping Carrie in check before she does something that would either be rash or something that would be that would hurt their chances to solve the case.
Thank you for that. How much research did you do for the book?
Well, typically I'm not a big research guy, so you're not going to find me writing those big, thick historical mysteries, because there's just too much research. I never liked history in school. It just really wasn't my thing. I'm more of what's going on in the present or the future. Science fiction is pretty interesting to me. But I do want to make sure that my books are accurate and believable. I'm really striving to get that verisimilitude. So I do whatever research it takes for me to kind of understand things. So in this case, I did a fair amount of research trying to understand stalking. What the characteristics of a stalker might be, and the kinds of feelings that, I hate to use the word typical, but a stalking victim might have. Nothing in this book is really autobiographical. I've never been stalked, thank goodness. But once I did have a situation where someone made me uncomfortable with some unwanted attention. And I think most people, certainly most women, have probably experienced something like this. But I have to tell you, it was pretty darn unsettling. And, in my writer's imagination, I sort of maybe started there and say, well, what would have happened if, this had happened, and then that had happened, and if I had responded this way, and this other person had responded that way, how far down the line could we have gotten with this? So, I sympathize for anyone who's gotten, unwanted attention or been stalked. It's terrifying.
Absolutely, yes. I'm grateful that I have never been to that extreme as well. But like you said, I've had experiences that have left me unsettled. And
right.
I think even if people have not been full on stalked, they're going to be able to relate to the character Jessica, who is the one that they are trying to help, who is being stalked in this story.
Yeah. I think most people have, to some extent, come across someone who has, sent their hackles up, something that they get some weird vibes from. And just imagine, if you dial that up, 10 or 100 times, what it might be like to have, a true, honest to goodness stalker after you. My goodness.
Right. And the book does escalate. It starts out with just phone calls, and then it moves on from there. And again, I don't want to give things away, but it does escalate. And so that it's not just, I don't want to say that the calls were not that threatening, but it escalates to more personal, more frightening, more immediate dangers throughout the book. So you have that building tension, which is always good in a thriller.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that's a fairly common pattern for stalking, which, again, during my research, I sort of found that out, that things can escalate very quickly and unfortunately, very violently.
So what is it about writing thrillers that appeals to you?
I love reading thrillers. I love to have my heart pounding and try to, just turn those pages as fast as I can to see what happens, see if the heroes are going to be able to solve situation. And really, it's that simple for me. I like to write stories that have people turning the pages as fast as they can. Once in a while, I'll get a communication from a reader and say, darn you, Alan, I stayed up to 3 a.m. because I had to finish your book, or stuff like that. So if I hear something like that, that's sort of the ultimate compliment, that people have put aside what they're doing, their regular routine, and they've had to keep reading my book. That's kind of the goal I'm trying to achieve.
Mhm. Yeah, the staying at, do you get the I stayed up until 3 a.m. because I couldn't sleep because of your book comments?
Well, I haven't. No, it's mostly I had to finish reading. But the other thing would be just as much of a compliment to me. Yes.
Yeah.
People tell me they had bad dreams or stuff like that.
Yeah, and this is definitely more toward the suspense side of thrillers. There are some incidences that uh, display violence, but it's not terribly graphic or violent in more of I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's definitely on the
there's not a
suspense
high body.
side
There's
of
not a high
thriller.
body count.
Yes,
Right?
thank you.
Sometimes writers talk about the HBC, the high body count.
Yeah.
It's not like that.
So it's definitely going to give you nightmares or keep you awake from the suspense, from the oh my gosh, what's next, rather than from just overt violence or the high body count, which are the type of thrillers I prefer. I'm not great with a lot of blood, so thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
I am getting braver about the thrillers that I read, but I'm still kind of a wimp when it comes to this type of book. Let's go ahead and take our next break. When we come back, we'll be talking about whether or not Anderson and Carey will be making a repeat performance in another book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, I was once again confessing my factor when it comes to thrillers, but I am growing. I am learning to appreciate thrillers more than I ever did before. Let's go ahead and get back to the interview with Alan Orloff.
On the cover, this is listed as a PI thriller, and you did talk a little bit about wanting to write a private investigator novel. Will there be others with Anderson and Carey, or will there be others with other PIs? What are your thoughts on writing more thrillers in this genre?
Yeah, I would love to write another Anderson West thriller. That would be a PI novel thriller. That would be great. But publishing is sort of a very odd duck as a business, and a lot depends on if the publisher would want to see another in the series. But and I had a lot of fun writing it, and like you said, it's my first real opportunity to write a private eye novel or series, and I've already got an idea for the next book, kind of mapped out. I've written the first chapter, so we'll see where it goes. I mean, there's nothing contracted at the moment, but you never know. So
yeah,
hopefully. And as far as other PIs, I'd probably write another Anderson West novel before I introduce more private eye characters. Yeah, probably.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, I definitely think there's room to not only have more stories, but also to see how Carey and Anderson grow as characters throughout a series.
Yes, I've heard that comment a lot. They're like, "Wow, it'd be great to see what happens with Carey next."
Yeah.
For some reason, maybe it's not uncommon. that a secondary character, because sometimes you can write them a little more vividly, if that makes sense. They're on screen. They're on screen. They're on, at the forefront a little bit less typically, so you can have them do wilder things. Like you couldn't have a book of just the main character just doing crazy wild things the entire book. That would be kind of goofy, I think. But sometimes a secondary character can stand out more, and I think it's definitely the case with Carrie. She has a much stronger personality, let's put it that way, I think, than Anderson does. One of my early readers suggested that I just write a book all from Carrie's point of view and forget Anderson, just have her go crazy. So that'd be intense, I think. But
I think it would be, yeah. Are there any of your other books that you would like to highlight or mention at this point?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. You mentioned sort of a different kind of thriller. So my previous novel, I think you would classify more of a high concept thriller with a much higher body count, and it had a much more of a save the world kind of premise, whereas I think you correctly identified I Know Where You Sleep as more of a suspense. The stakes are, while they're very high for Jessica, the victim, for society at large, they're probably not that great. But in Pray for the Innocent, the stakes are very high. So let me just give you the sort of the premise. In the shadow of the Pentagon, so this takes place in D.C., there was a secret DOD, Department of Defense, experiment on brain research that has gone terribly wrong. So a special ops trained soldier escapes from the lab believing he is a Russian terrorist, straight from the pages of a 1980s spy novel. And he's on the loose, and the feds have to figure out how to catch this guy, and they turn to the only person they can, and that's the author of the book who wrote in the 1980s, who's now a retired English professor who's a recluse who wants nothing to do with this. So while there's a sort of, it kicks off with sort of a science fiction twist at the beginning, I thought that was a pretty cool premise for a novel. And it was fortunate enough to win the last year's Thriller Award for Best Ebook Original. So, and I got the idea. You may appreciate this. I got the idea for that novel, the premise. I woke up with it at 4 a.m. and it was practically fully formed in my head, which has never happened since. In fact, when I wake up and I don't have an idea like that, I'm a little bit disappointed every morning. But
right.
It was crazy. It's never happened before in the past, and I'm guessing it won't happen again, but it was nuts. Anyway.
Did you write it down immediately, or did you remember it?
Yeah. No, I wrote it down, and I remember the next morning, this was on a Sunday morning, so the next day I called my agent. I said, "You're not going to believe this. I woke up with this amazing premise of this idea for this novel. What should I do?" And she's like, "Okay, well, put aside the novel." I was working on a novel at the time. I was about halfway done. Put aside the one you're working on and just write this one. So I did, and it came out pretty much close to my vision. And it came out pretty good. So I was pleased with that.
And it got an award, and so it must have been a really good 4 a.m. dream you had that you then woke up and. Yeah, that's really cool.
Pray that happens again. And I also have a couple of, while I'm talking about books, I got a couple of stories in the anthologies that just came out this spring. Both pretty cool projects. One is called The Swamp Killers, and in it there were 14 or 15 of us that sort of tell a novel in stories. So each of us tells a story, and they're sort of loosely connected to tell a larger narrative arc. And this sort of is a follow-up of an anthology. This is pretty much the same group of writers did 2 years ago, called The Night of the Flood. And so that's kind of an interesting project to see, have one story told. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, did Ed Amar work on that?
Yes.
Okay.
He's one of the co-editors.
Okay, yeah, he was on the podcast a while ago, and I remember him talking about the Night of the Flood. So that's really cool.
Yeah, Yeah, it was very cool. Both, they're not your typical anthology. Let's put it that way. You get different voices and different tones and styles kind of telling the same story. So it's pretty cool. And then another very interesting project that I'm involved with is an anthology where all of the stories are inspired by Joni Mitchell songs. And that's called The Beat of Black Wings, which is the title of one of her songs. And that just came out, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I'm really honored to be included because the roster of writers is just a who's who of who's writing great short fiction in the mystery community. So if you're a Joni Mitchell fan, it's at least cool to see sort of the interpretations or sort of the jumping off points where different writers, the avenues they took to sort of based on her songs to come up with the inspiration for their stories. So that was kind of cool.
2 follow-up questions on that. First, what Joni Mitchell song did you write about?
Well, I picked I'm a pretty big Joni Mitchell fan. I picked mine based on the title. Most of the other writers picked it on the song, whether they like the song or the lyrics or whatever. I chose mine almost exclusively on the title because the song I picked was Sex Kills. And I thought that would provide me with many opportunities to come up with a great story. So, yeah, so that was pretty cool.
And then my second question is, how on earth did somebody, that's really fascinating. Somebody is just listening to Joni Mitchell and they think I should get a bunch of writers to write stories based on her songs. How did that come about? Do you know?
Well, I'm pretty good friends with the editor, Josh Pachter. And he has a story where he had come up with a short story with the character's name was Killer Kyle, which was a Joni Mitchell song from one of her songs, lyric from one of her songs. And he tried to place it, and he couldn't really. And then at the same time, he sort of noticed that there were other anthologies based on artists' music. Like there's a Bruce Springsteen anthology, and there's a Steely Dan anthology, and a Go-Go's anthology. And he thought, you know what? Why not Joni Mitchell? So that's sort of where the idea was born. And yeah, I've read a few of the stories so far, and they are just terrific. So I'm looking forward to reading the rest of them.
Yeah, and again, what was the name of that one?
It's called The Beat of Black Wings. And let me add that 1/3 of the proceeds are going to be donated to the Brain Aneurysm Foundation, the Brain Aneurysm, whatever I think it's foundation. Joni Mitchell had a brain aneurysm a few years ago, which she's recovered from. So we thought that would be nice to donate some money to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
I always love hearing where people come up with ideas for things like anthologies or really ideas for anything. I'm just fascinated when they have an idea and then they execute that idea and it works and it's great. I feel like I have ideas, but they just swirl around in my brain. I'm sure I've done something with an idea once or twice, maybe. I'll think about that. I'll get back to you. Let's go ahead and take another break. When we come back, we'll be wrapping up this episode and talking about Alan's alter ego. So, well, his pen name at any rate. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Alan Orloff.
You also write as Zach Allen, So can you talk a little bit about that writing? Are there differences in the writing style, the genre, et cetera, from what you write as yourself, as Alan?
Yes, as the real me. Yeah, that sort of came about. I had written, I guess, 3 stories. My first 3 stories were with a publisher called Midnight Ink. And they were fairly traditional, not too violent. They didn't have high body counts. There wasn't like gore on the page really. Mysteries. And I at the time I'd come up with this idea for, all my agents hate me because I don't write in one genre. I sort of bounce around a little bit, which makes it a little difficult to find an audience and build an audience. But at this time I had come up with this great, what I thought was a great idea that involved cannibals. And so I wrote this novel. It's a horror novel. And I'm sort of writing it, and just coming up with crazy, gory, disgusting things that made sense for this book. And I'm realizing that the people that really enjoyed, say, my first book, Diamonds for the Dead, which was an Agatha Award nominee, so a traditional mystery, they probably may not be the same people who would like this cannibal book, which was called The Taste. And I wanted to have some way to sort of signal to those loyal readers that this might be a little different. I didn't want, a lover of gentle mysteries to pick up The Taste thinking, oh, look, another Alan Orloff book. Let's give it a read. And then for them to get, 20 pages in and and be really
oh my
angry
gosh.
that Yes, exactly. Now, hopefully it's obvious from the cover and the title and the book description on the back what kind of book it is, but I didn't want to take anybody to take any chances. So that was sort of where the Zach Allen originated. And then I had a couple other books that were also a little gorier probably than my typical. So I thought, well, I might as well put those up as, publish those as Zach Allen. At some point, I may go back to my backlist and just make them all Alan Orloffs. I haven't decided. Yeah, but there probably won't be any more Zach Allens coming out, unless I think of another horror novel, and then maybe.
You just never know. That might be your next 4
You never
a.m.
know, right?
revelation.
Exactly.
Yes. What are you working on right now?
What am I working on now? Well, I've got a book that's finished, that's making the rounds. Editors are reading at different publishers. And that's, it's another, I would classify that as a suspense novel. And I'm in the middle of trying to revise another book that's about sort of a family of con artists. And, I wrote pretty much an entire first draft, and I sort of realized things just didn't come together the way I wanted. So I'm in the process of going back and trying to revise and move things around and rejigger everything. So that's kind of what I'm into now. And I'm still, writing the occasional short story if I find something that's interesting. One, I just sold a short story to Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine called Gator Palooza, which I'm not sure when that's going to be published. Hopefully within the next year. So got a lot of things going on.
Yeah, you do. So when did you start writing? Is it something that you've always wanted to do? Have you always written, or did you start writing later in life? How did that work for you?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that I didn't like reading some of those classics in high school English. Well, I should have said that I didn't like high school English, period, much to the consternation of my father, who was an ex-English teacher in high school. I was always a numbers guy. So I went to University of Maryland as an undergrad, and I studied engineering. So I never had to take an English class. I never had to write creatively whatsoever. I did engineering for a little bit. I didn't really like engineering, so I went back to business school, in which case I never had to take an English class, never had to do any creative writing. And so throughout most of my career, I never had to do any creative writing. I never took a creative writing class. I didn't know anything from anything. So maybe 15 or 20 years ago, I sort of looked to my wife and I said, I think I want to write. And then I had to bend over and pick her up because she had fainted, and I revived her, and she's like, okay, well, whatever. So being the engineer that I was, I wrote a few proof of concept short stories, and they weren't horrible, so that kept me going. I took an adult ed class at the local high school, introduction to creative writing or something. And as part of that, I had to write a short story, and it didn't stink. And the instructor was complimentary. She said, you know what, this is not so terrible. This has some promise. The first thing you do is need to get rid of all the semicolons that you use, but otherwise, it had some potential. So I kept at it, and I took more workshops, and I joined up with some critique groups and kept working on my craft, and kept writing novels, manuscripts, and submitting them and trying to get agents and so on. Sort of the typical way that a beginning writer tries to break into the business. And I just kept at it. I didn't give up, and I got an agent, and I sold a book, and so on. So no, it's not something I always wanted to do. Something that came to me rather later in life. I've always been a big reader, though, and I think that's what sort of propelled me forward. Yeah.
And in terms of reading, then, you mentioned you didn't like the classics in high school. You preferred horror or thriller. Does that tend to be your go-to genre now, or do you have favorite genres or authors that you like to read for yourself?
Yeah. Well, most of what I read is in the mystery, thriller, crime fiction genre. I have a lot of friends that I've met at these conferences and conventions and at various other events. So I like to read their work and support them. So I read a lot of my friends' books and so on. I'm not going to mention them because I'm sure I would leave somebody out. I do like to read, I read Stephen King. I'd like to read horror when I get a chance. Once in a while, I like to read science fiction. So it's sort of the same, and I've been reading those all my life. Once in a while, I like to read some young adult fiction, too. Coming of age story, something like that. But, I don't read a whole lot of nonfiction, and I don't read a whole lot of historical stuff. Although, as I get older, what I think is, things that are historical changes, right? There's a great series, I will mention, James Ziskins writes a great series, the Ellie Stone mysteries, that's set in the 1960s. And in some classifications, that's a historical mystery, right? But, I don't want to date myself. That doesn't seem like so historical to me.
Right. It's not like Regency or something like that.
Right. Someone was saying that they wrote a historical short story that took place in the 80s. I'm like, what? The 1980s?
I know.
I think in the 1880s. No, but he was talking the 1980s. I'm like, wow.
Yeah. It's the same with music when you hear songs that you grew up with on the classic radio station,
right.
And you
classic
think,
oldies,
what?
Yeah,
yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Jumping back in here so we can take our final break of the podcast. When we come back, Alan will be giving us some advice in case you are an aspiring author. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Alan Orloff.
Okay, good. Do you have advice for aspiring authors from your own experience?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I mentioned I took these workshops. There's a great facility, a great resource in Bethesda, Maryland, called the Writer Center. So I took some workshops there, 10, 12 years ago. And 10 or 12 years later, I have gone back to be an instructor for workshops. So it sort of went full circle. And I've noticed certain things that many of my students, they'd come into roadblocks. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give to someone who wants to write a novel, for instance, is to finish, to get to be able to write the two words, the end. I've, had encountered so many writers who, they want to write a novel, so they'll write a first chapter, and they'll go back and they'll revise it, and they'll revise it, and they'll hone it, and they'll tweak it, and they'll spend weeks and weeks and months trying to get that first chapter just right, thinking or believing that they need to have a good foundation to really build their story on. So they work on that first chapter. So then they'll move on to the second chapter, and they'll spend a lot of time writing it and revising it and polishing it and tweaking it and so on. And then they'll look and they'll say, you know what, this chapter is really good, but there's what I've written has made me want to change some things in the first chapter. So they'll go back to the first chapter and they'll tweak it and tweak it and tweak it. And then they go to the third chapter and so on and so on. And they never get to the end. And what I found is by getting to the end, then you've laid your entire story out. And more often than not, once you've written your entire story, it's different than what you had planned your entire story to be when you were first starting out. So for instance, those first two chapters that you spent maybe 5 months polishing and revising and so on, that might not even be where your story starts. Your story might start in chapter 3, or it might take an entirely different turn, in which case you have to totally revise chapters 1 and 2 anyway. So, and again, this does not work for everyone. I'm the first person to say, hey, if you're doing something and it's working, stick with it. Don't listen to advice from somebody else who's not in your shoes, who's not at your seat with fingers on your keyboard, right? You need to do what works for you. But I think there's so much value in getting to the end and knowing that you have the wherewithal to write an 80,000 word or 50,000 word or 120,000 word story that somewhat makes sense. And we all know that good books aren't written, they are rewritten. So no matter how great your first draft is going to be, odds are that you're going to have to go back and revise it significantly for it to match your vision that you have for the book. So that would probably be my biggest advice, is to get to the end. And in order to get to the end, some people need some sort of routine. So whether it's a daily quota by word count or a time, I write 2 hours every Saturday or whatever it is, as long as you're making forward progress and you can get to the end, I think you're in much better shape.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I know you have a website, so if you could tell people where they can find your website and where they might be able to interact with you on social media.
Sure. Website is at alanorloff.com, and I try to keep it updated fairly frequently now that virtually every single appearance and convention and conference has been canceled for this year, sadly. I probably have to go back and revise my events page, but you can kind of keep up with what's going on there, and there's links to my books and so on. The anthologies, I think, are all up there, and they will be shortly. And you can find, I'm pretty active on Facebook, and it's Alan Orloff, and maybe it's Alan S. Orloff. Anyway, it's the one that's the writer. And don't think you need to be a friend of mine to be, friend me on Facebook. Most of what I write is just for public consumption anyway. And I'm on Twitter at Alan Orloff, and I'm on Instagram, although I'm not as active on Instagram. I don't take a lot of photos. Sometimes I do. I always forget to put them on Instagram. So those are probably the places I'm online the most.
Well, I did look, and it is Alan S. Orloff for Facebook.
Thank you. Thank you.
But it came up either way when I typed in your name. So you're not hard to find. Alan,
there's one other Alan Orloff.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we've talked about a lot of different topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention in terms of the new book, I Know Where You Sleep, or writing in general?
It's also a pleasure for me to work with the great folks at Down and Out Books, which is the publisher of I Know Where You Sleep. They're not one of the super large guys, but they do a lot of really excellent crime fiction. They do a lot of noir stuff, a lot of detective books. They do a lot of these anthologies. And so if that's your thing, visit their website. They've got some great deals going on. They ran a COVID-19 sale where they had 30 books or something for $1.99 or $2.99 or some things in there. And I'd say support your local independent bookstores. Again, with them being physically shut down, some of them are going to kind of have some struggling to survive. So if you want to help support them, go online and order books, and I'm sure they'll be happy to ship them out.
Absolutely, yes. And you can help them out in that way because most of them are still doing online orders.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you talking to me about your new book, I Know Where You Sleep.
Well, Sarah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and I will see you online, I hope.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you again to Alan for taking the time to speak with me. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I so very much appreciate you and would love to hear from you. Feel free to hit me up on social media and give me your thoughts on the podcast, the interviews, the books, etc. What are you reading, especially now in isolation? What have you been reading? I would love to hear from you. So go ahead and check out GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and let me know how you're doing. I know I've said thank you a bunch of times, but really gratitude. I just feel grateful for the authors that I speak to and you, my listeners. So once again, thank you. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do give us a nice review, whether that's written or 5-star. We would so appreciate it. Follow us on social media, do all those wonderful things like retweeting and sharing and all those great social media things, social technical terms, social media things that help our podcast get out to more listeners and readers like yourselves. Hope you're having a great week. I will be back with another interview. This one, a dear friend of mine who has written a children's book with a dear friend of hers, and that is called Morris, Somewhere Out There. So please join me as I interview Penny Waldy about that book. Have a great week. Hope you're staying safe, staying well, staying sane, whatever it takes. And I hope you have, I'm pretty sure unless you're an essential worker, you do have plenty of time, but I hope you're taking the time to get lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.